Hey everybody, welcome to my video on business cycle versus growth. We're not going to work through any solved problems. I'm just going to show a couple of relationships. So here we go. We've got this graph we will often see with time measured in quarters or years or whatever. And we've got something with GDP on this axis. What we see is that GDP goes up and then down and then up and then down and then up and on and on and on forever. Contractions are when GDP is falling. Expansions are when it's rising. So let's rehash some of this just a little bit. First, let me get rid of these letters so they don't distract us too much. During a contraction, this red period where GDP is falling, there's another one down here. During these contractions, GDP is falling, which means production is falling, which means we don't need to hire as many workers to do our production, and so unemployment is probably rising. That is stuff that we generally expect to see. Usually, not always, we also will see that inflationary pressures fall. This relationship's a little weaker than it used to be for who knows how many reasons, so I'm going to leave that out for now, but just know that that's also potentially happening behind the scenes. Now, during expansions, these green periods, we've got 2.5 business cycles up here. During expansions, GDP is rising, which means that our production is increasing, which means our unemployment rate is falling. Now, as this cycle goes around and around and around, you'll notice it tends to be cycling around some sort of middle level, where it's sometimes above and sometimes below. So let's think about that for just a minute here. When we look at different parts of the business cycle, there are these periods where production is higher than this middle point, and there are these periods where production is lower than this middle point. During these, our GDP is either above its average level, or its sustainable level, or its potential level, or it's below it. So let's put some words on this. This black line is potential GDP, also called potential output. And at this potential GDP, we also have a condition called full employment. Full employment, or the natural rate of unemployment, is the employment level that exists when there's no cyclical unemployment. And that happens all on this line. This is where there's full employment. Now, in our yellow sections, GDP is lower than potential GDP, which means our actual unemployment will be greater than the natural rate of unemployment. Why? Because GDP is less than what it would be at full employment. So there's going to be less people working than what would be during full employment. And so unemployment is higher than at full employment. Likewise, in any of these blue sections, our unemployment rate is going to be less than the natural rate of unemployment. So this is business cycle, and this is how the unemployment rate and the GDP fluctuate compared to the full employment, the potential GDP. Those two things happen simultaneously, and then our cycle brings us all around it. Now, let's add growth to this. A picture of growth doesn't actually need a business cycle. See, we can have time on this axis and GDP, and growth is just when your potential GDP expands. Now, I do want to put one little note here, just for being specific. We're usually looking at GDP per capita, because if your GDP grew at the exact same rate of the population, it doesn't actually make anyone better off, right? What makes people better off is if there's more production and income per person. So growth is when this thing has an upward slope, where our potential is getting bigger and better. Now, where does growth come from? Well, there's two main areas. We can, one, increase capital per worker, and this capital can be physical, like tools and equipment and machinery, or it can be human capital, which has to do with our skills and abilities and our health and everything that affects how capable we are of doing work. If you can increase your capital per worker, that promotes growth. So that includes more equipment per worker, it includes better education and a healthier workforce. The other thing that really promotes growth is technology growth. If the resources we have are better at producing, we'll be able to produce more. Now, is there still a business cycle when there's growth? Of course. But the thing is that the business cycle is going to cycle around the growth path. We'll still have our ups, we'll still have our downs, these time periods where our unemployment rate's higher than the natural rate, these times where our unemployment rate is lower than the natural rate, we'll still have those. Our natural rate of unemployment might change over time. It probably will if we're having growth. But the important thing to note, and whether we have low growth or high growth, or whether we're over here or over there will still be a business cycle happening around it. The business cycle is short term, and it centers on potential GDP. Growth is when potential GDP changes, thereby changing what we're centering our business cycle around. Now, a couple of quick notes about economic policy. There are short-run stabilization policies, and those usually involve trying to eliminate the business cycle. During these blue ranges, they're trying to decrease GDP to get to potential GDP. And during these yellow ranges, they're trying to increase GDP to get to potential GDP. There are reasons for this. We'll talk about them later, but those policies are about short-term stabilization. They don't necessarily promote growth. If you want to get growth, you need to address these issues. Getting our workers more stuff, better stuff, and having them be healthier and smarter. So I hope this is helpful. I hope it helps to separate out the business cycle versus growth. If not, too bad, but let me know if you have questions. Thanks for watching, guys. Good luck and happy econing.